Hi, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to Perforce's webinar on Beyond Scrum. Today we're going to talk about some problems with Scrum that folks are running into and introduce a new and we hope better model for Agile development. Just a couple points of housekeeping before we get going. We are using GoToWebinar for the presentation today. If you have any questions, just go ahead and put them in the GoToWebinar chat panel. We will have some time for Q&A at the end. If we don't have a chance to get to your question today, we'll also follow up over email later on. If you have any technical difficulties with the presentation, then please go ahead and let us know in the chat window, and we'll try to get you some help right away. And we will have a recording of this webinar available within the next few days. The last thing I'll mention before we jump in is that this actually is quite a long and involved topic. We're kind of just touching on the key highlights here. We will have some follow-up material and hopefully some additional webinars in the future. So my name is Randy DeFau. I'm a technical marketing manager here at Perforce. I've been heavily involved with Agile for several years now, work closely with Perforce's Agile engineering teams, also a member of Perforce's Agile marketing team, and I also have attained the Scrum Master certification. The other presenter today is Andy Singleton, the CEO and founder of Assembla, which is one of Perforce's partners. They offer hosted Perforce on demand. Andy has released over 20 online software and service products in the course of his career, so he has a wealth of real-world experience on this topic. So let's just take a minute to talk about the companies. Perforce makes fast, scalable version control available on pretty much any platform you can imagine. And our goal is to provide effective version management solutions for any type of team, no matter what type of product you build and where you happen to build it. Assembla offers cloud-based tools for distributed Agile development with an emphasis on Agile planning, some great ticketing and task management tools, which you'll see a little bit later on. And of course, they do code and repository management, including offering Perforce on demand. They have over 500,000 users, and what's actually more relevant for today's talk, Andy manages a development team that's located in 15 countries around the world. So with that, let's jump right in. So, what's the problem with Scrum? Well, Scrum was originally designed as a model for small teams, typically co-located so they could have the stand-up meetings and actually be face-to-face every day for fairly narrowly scoped projects. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means later on. And also, Scrum typically has a fixed release cycle. So there's kind of a fixed length for the sprint. So how does this manifest itself? Well, for one thing, if your Scrum teams get larger and you have more of them, you end up having to come to some kind of compromise about how to manage that. So Scrums being a popular approach, and you end up with something that starts to resemble a more formal hierarchy of teams and planning. Another problem is that with the fixed iteration cycle, particularly when you're talking about more than one teams, you do come to a point where you need to integrate and merge all this work together. And if that's not happening until the end of a 2-week or 4-week sprint, and you're talking about managing several different teams or a project with lots of dependencies between the different pieces, there's a high probability that you're going to hit some integration pain. And integration pain means that you're kind of throwing your wrench into the whole works, and you're causing some significant amount of rework to occur. And of course, all these problems just get worse the more you try to release. And some of today's challenges where people have found Scrum to be a little bit limiting, again, big multi-platform projects, trying to manage teams that aren't co-located, larger teams that are in different locations, trying to release more and more frequently. And some of the folks that first ran into this are those that are trying to build on-demand apps and services where they're trying to release as often as daily. So that's just a quick snapshot of some of the problems that we're trying to address. And now I will turn it over to Andy to talk about a new approach.
Thanks, Randy. At Assembla, we have all of the problems that Randy just talked about in our development projects. So we went looking for a better Agile development approach. We found that almost all of our customers that were large customers were using Scrum. We tried to look beyond Scrum, and we had a couple of goals. One is to make the process simpler. So we're trying to remove some rituals that you have to do as a co-located group to make it easier to join projects, make it easier for us to manage multiple teams, and specifically to make it easier for us to manage distributed teams. And in doing so, we're going to have a lot less emphasis on face-to-face team dynamics. This is a nice thing about Scrum. It's very motivational. It's one of the things that draws people to Scrum. But in our world, it's nice, but it's definitely a luxury, and we find that we can have very productive projects without it. The trade-off is we're going to rely more heavily on technology. So we've simplified the sort of the ritualistic life of the team, but we have added some complexity to the technology. And we're going to particularly rely on code management with code review and code contribution. So we're going to make the process by which code gets reviewed, accepted, and released a core part of our Agile concept. And if we do this, if you accept this idea, you can look out in the world and you can see people that are working in this way that have achieved astonishing levels of speed and scale. Facebook released a note that they now release twice per day. They can release code from 600 developers every week. Android uses a code contribution process which accepts changes from thousands of people in every release, and even from large partner companies like Qualcomm. So that's what we're going to go for. What we came up with in looking at some of these examples is the process that you see in this slide. It starts with a prioritized backlog, exactly the same way that a Scrum process starts or a Konban process, and with exactly the same process of pulling what you're going to work on out onto your task board. We've labeled it current work here. At that point, it turns into a Konban process where instead of pulling a complete sprint iteration, you're going to pull one task at a time. The contributor is going to say, I'm going to do that one thing, work it through. They're going to test it in their own self-managed development environment. So here's where you get to some of the tricks that make this thing scalable. When they're sure that it works, they're going to say, this works, you should include it in your production release, and a release manager is going to take what's ready and plan a release, pull it together and release it. What we've done here is very simple. We've taken the planning from the beginning. At the beginning, we don't do any iteration planning. We just do prioritization. And we put it at the end where it doesn't need to be a batch process. We want to get a couple of advantages from this. The first advantage we want to get is continuous delivery. Continuous delivery is a hot topic because it's faster. You're going to get releases and your fixes out faster. And it also accommodates a much larger range of tasks than a 2-week cycle, long and short. Our big issue was we wanted to manage distributed and dispersed teams, so we need to get rid of those team meetings. And finally, in doing so, we wanted to scale to more contributors. We've gotten rid of the batch processes, centralized iteration planning, centralized testing. We want to include new types of contributors, not just hackers, not just Scrum teams, outsourcers, partners, the guys that you have working with you already. And we wanted to make this Scrum compatible. So if you have a high-performance Scrum team, which I know is a very valuable asset, they can act as contributors in this process without any process change. They can just pull a sprint backlog and go. The building block for this process, we're going to present 3 building blocks for this process. The first building process is tools and techniques for managing distributed teams. The second is tools and techniques for continuous delivery, which seems like a big challenge, but actually turns out to have a very specific solution. And finally, the on-demand infrastructure, the cloud-based tools that we all of a sudden now have to create on-demand test and integration environments. We're going to talk about tasks and tools for distributed teams. Here's a picture of a couple features from Assembla. Assembla is all about distributed teams. When we started working on continuous delivery, we had to make a few changes. So on the left side, you'll see a picture of our Agile Planner, which in the continuous delivery mode just has one backlog in one current work bin, and some nice ways for prioritizing and moving work between the two. So we've gotten rid of those milestones or iterations that you typically see. And on the right side, you see one of the core fundamental tools of distributed team management, which is an activity stream. We want everyone to see at all times what their other team members are working on. There's a whole bunch of other stuff in Assembla, but we'll move on.
So Perforce is trying to approach some of the same problems from a slightly different tack. So, one of the key things that Andy mentioned when he presented that overall diagram of this process is that he's taken the planning out of the front and moved it onto the back of the process, which means that his teams can just work on tasks and deliver them as soon as they're ready. And then towards the end, they don't have to plan ahead. They just look at what's available, and then they plan a release. And that does get you a lot closer to this continuous delivery goal. But it actually is challenging in a few different ways. And one of the ways is that you do have teams working around the world. And in order for them to be able to work together this quickly and be able to coordinate effectively, Perforce believes that you have to provide the right SCM or version management, code management infrastructure for them. And I think this is actually probably not news. There was actually a distributed Agile case study several years ago that kind of found that having a repository that is logically accessible to the entire team is one of the key factors that lets them work together more effectively. So that's why Perforce is trying to support anybody on any type of team wherever they happen to be working. And we do that with a few different service layers. So there's kind of the core shared versioning service at the heart of everything. And then as you go out to, say, different remote sites, people working on different types of data, different types of teams, there's proxies, replication services, Git connectors. But the goal is that however people happen to be connecting, they still have a place where they can get the right set of data and they can access anything they need to work on, even if, for instance, the teams in Berlin and Chicago are collaborating closely on a single piece of code. That's not an obstacle for them.
And now I'm going to talk about the steps that you can take to get to continuous delivery. The first thing I'm going to talk about is how to deliver continuous work, which is a little different than continuous delivery. You can still do continuous work on an iterative release. In the typical iterative release, we think of as a Scrum sprint. In this diagram, you select a certain number of tasks at the beginning. That's your sprint backlog. And then you burn it up. You do the work until you're done. Hopefully it looks smooth like this, but in reality, it doesn't. In a Konban process, you don't select all your tasks at the beginning. You just select the number of tasks that you can work on. That's your work in progress. And then as you finish one task, you pick the other, you pick the next, and you go indefinitely, which is great if you're doing continuous delivery, but we're going to have to adapt this initially to an iterative release process. The iterative adaptation is this Scrum bond diagram. And I believe that most people who use distributed teams in Scrum actually do this. I know that we did. They work in a Kanban process. They select out the number of tasks they can work on, one at a time. They do that for a while, and then they get to the point where they say, hey, we have to do a release. And they feature freeze it, and then they stabilize it, and they release. The advantage of this is you just got rid of the iteration planning, and now you can work with a distributed team. If you want to do continuous delivery, you have to do a little bit more work, but it's very specific what you have to do. Most software projects begin with a test pattern illustrated here. They take all their changes that they want to release, they merge them together into a release candidate, and then they test that release candidate. And they keep doing that until they have a high-quality release. It's been done for 50 or 60 years. You can't get continuous delivery out of that because when you stick everything together, you always find some problems, and it hasn't been tested. If you have a different test system for each one of your contributors, you can get continuous delivery. So this is a diagram of that process. Each contributor has their own test system. We have this magical cloud technology. You run continuous integration on every one of those changes, and you use your QA team essentially as a consultant who gets called over to test important changes, and then when those are ready, you stick them into the production revision. We've actually built some features in Assembla to drive this workflow. So the feature that you saw illustrated before was merge request. We can take a bunch of changes out of, for instance, a Perforce stream, package them up as a merge request, send them on to a reviewer, and present in this nice UI where they can discuss the change, they can accept it or reject it, they can see what's in the change, and so on. And this code review process actually turns out to be fairly important in a continuous delivery process because you need a place to ask for tests. You're going to need automated tests. You're going to need to ask your developers for them, and this is the place to do it.
So before I jump in and talk about Perforce merge, I just want to mention a couple of personal perspectives on what Andy just talked about. So, first, I think the merge request is a great workflow. I actually have been using the Perforce streams on demand that Assembla offers for a couple of little side projects. And I've used the simple merge request system. One of the things I'm really excited about is Assembla is going to be introducing some more introducing continuous integration as a more integrated part of that workflow, and I think Andy's going to talk about that a little bit later on. I think that's great because I know continuous integration is such a key part of making sure that you're testing everything that you're delivering in a rapid cycle, and it's great to have that as a more integrated part of the workflow. The other thing is, back on the Scrum slide, when I said I was part of an Agile marketing team, I think that's actually what we were doing. Because in marketing, the technology company, it's extremely difficult to plan anything that looks like a release because we're working on such a weird array of things. And so it was pretty much Konban, let's just grab a bunch of stuff and work on it as fast as we can. And then at the end of the month, we'll just call it done and have a review meeting that doesn't really have a lot of perspective to offer. So even from a non-technology firm, I think there's a lot of truth in Andy's observations on Scrumban. So anyway, moving right along. Again, code management, like Andy said, is such a key part of this technology because if you're going to be having tens or hundreds or thousands of contributors who are grabbing tasks, working them, being responsible for merging with the state of the production system, as soon as they're done with the task, testing it and delivering it, then code merge is a key part of that workflow, and it has to be an easy and natural part of daily work for everybody who's contributing. And again, Perforce code management is one of our strong points we pride ourselves on. So we try to make sure that merging can be a natural, fast, and easy part of daily work. So we built some tools that provide some intuitive guidance for working, things like Perforce streams that Assembla offers in their hosted repositories, merge notifications, so some visual tools to let you know when something's done, where it needs to go. The ability to switch quickly back and forth between different tasks, and some other great visual tools. Now, the other area where we put a little bit of focus is, what happens after that handoff of you're done with the task, you've kind of tested it, and then you deliver it. And that question is actually a little bit more complex for folks who are not working on a pure SaaS-based system or folks that are working on heavily component-based development. So after you hand off a task, it may work well in the main line, kind of the current production version, but a lot of our customers are dealing with complex component models of development. So a single product may be made up of tens or as many as a few hundred different components, and there's a lot of complex dependencies between them. So we like to focus on being able to deliver the right set of data to everybody. So when a developer is working on a task, they can grab the right set of data for the particular thing they're working on, even if it means that they need to grab particular versions of 17 different components. Being able to adjust that very quickly. So if there's a new release of a library that's shared, then everybody who needs to consume that can do a very fast update. And being able to, again, do all of this on demand so you can keep working on that very fast delivery cycle.
Now I'm going to talk about tools to build and test on demand. As you heard me say, I believe that this is the key factor that gets you to continuous delivery. This is a diagram of the way that Assembla has set up their continuous integration system. We've actually rigged up Jenkins, which is a server that helps you run continuous integration processes, to look at each merge request and build and test that merge request and actually vote on it as a code review vote. It's a trick we got from Garrett. If it moves through that gate and at least one reviewer likes it, then it's ready to go out into those test environments that you can call QA people over to look at. And there's another process that runs a deploy. And we've actually hooked this all up so that it writes back where your code is and so on. I think they call that traceability. But you can use any or all of this in your own process as needed.
Yep, and this is again where the integrating the continuous integration into that whole process, I think, is a great feature. So another factor of on-demand, again, for kind of focusing more on what happens after you maybe have delivered and tested on the production or mainline version of something. For a lot of our customers have situations where they're maintaining a lot of older legacy releases. They may have a complex feature matrix, so they're building basically the same software, but different tweaks for different platforms, different customer bases. And one of our customers actually runs an automatic merge after any particular change has been built, tested, and deployed into the production or mainline system. it's automatically merged to 50 other places where the entire process is repeated. And you can imagine that gets to be quite a complex process. And if you don't have the right machinery in place to manage that, things will quickly spiral out of control on you. In fact, one horror story I'd like to share that I actually heard from somebody who was moving off of another system into Perforce. They had actually shipped $800 million worth of defective product because they had not merged a bug fix to the branch that was actually shipping to the factory where the chips were being built. So this is the kind of problem that more on the release management side of the house has some real world consequences. So if you're going to follow continuous delivery, but you're in this situation where you have a complex feature matrix, maintaining a lot of customizations and such, you really do need to invest in the infrastructure and the logistics to make sure that something is built, tested, and deployed everywhere it is potentially used. The other factor about continuous integration is, again, you do need quite a lot of heavy artillery behind the scenes to support it. Just to give you a little success story here, Salesforce.com is a great Perforce customer. They gave a very interesting talk a couple years ago at our user conference where they shared some of the numbers, and the numbers are really just staggering. So Salesforce practices something they call extreme agile, some of the same goals as what we've been talking about today. And they have over 120 Scrum teams and over 90,000 automated tests. And so you can imagine at that scale that they are putting quite a bit of load on their SCM and CI infrastructure. And they built that out on top of Perforce. So if you're going to be practicing continuous integration and continuous delivery at scale, you need to plan ahead and make sure that you've got all of the logistics in place to make sure you can support all of that activity. It's great to practice continuous demand, not so good if you're overwhelming all of your key systems as a result. So again, Salesforce has experienced great success. This is one of their slides. They shared some numbers up until a few years ago where when they started making this transition to this more rapid Agile cycle, their days between releases went way down, while at the same time the number of features they're delivering went way up. So they actually did see some real-world success by moving to some of these more continuous delivery principles.
In the following slide, you'll see some release data from Assembla. You can see that at one point we were doing about 2 releases a month at the beginning of that graph. That's typical for a Scrum, or in this case, a Scrumban release process. But as our product got more complicated, that number went down. It actually got harder and harder to release our product until it was quite a painful process to integrate it and even debug it after releases. So we decided to move to continuous delivery, and there's a couple things that are good news about that. One is that we've been through the process. So we've started where people are when they don't have continuous delivery, and we understand the steps. Another piece of good news is you can see this is a very smooth process. As you put different techniques in, and especially change your testing and test rules, you can dramatically increase the number of releases per month or per day in sort of a continuous basis. And we're now up to 2.5 or 3 a day, and seeing really good reasons to go to even more releases and push through smaller changes. The biggest impact this has had for us, we've increased scale, we've increased velocity. The biggest impact has been a reduction in stress. So we don't have to worry about when stuff's going out or when it's going to get fixed. If you're interested in trying some of this, here are some suggested next steps. First of all, if you have a Scrum team, just try the Scrumban process. Skip the iteration plan and run the burn up, triage, feature freeze, and stabilize. A second thing you're going to definitely need, and if you're sophisticated probably already have, is continuous integration and automated tests. It's an ongoing process to put those in. You might find that my hint about code review will help you with that. If you're going to go to continuous delivery, you're going to start to want to run that continuous integration with a larger number of on-demand build and test systems. And finally, we have something that I call, actually I got from my friends at Serena, they call the continuous delivery dial. The idea is that you can get a lot of benefits from continuous delivery in the development phase. For instance, if developers are constantly moving stuff all the way through to what they consider to be a release, they don't have to think about it again. And it clears up a lot of working memory in their head So, among all the other sort of scaling benefits that you can get, you don't have to actually deliver that all the way through to production. You can dial back and forth, deliver it, for instance, to user acceptance testing or to localization, and run a batch process from there. So this can be a controlled process. You could also go to 11 on the dial and do what the guys at places like Yahoo do, high-volume websites, and release into production on a few servers, test it there, and then accept it into your gold master release if it passes the production test.
So that brings us to the end of our webinar. Again, I know this was quite a bit of information. It is a complex topic, but again, we will have some follow-up information to share with you in the future. But hopefully what Andy and I have shared will give you some food for thought on how to improve your Agile processes and move past some of the problems with Scrum, with some of the focus on code management and enabling distributed contributors that Andy mentioned. So now we do have time for a little bit of Q&A. Go ahead and put your questions into the chat window, and we'll go ahead and try to take as many of them as we can. I'll start off with a question for Andy. Can I use this model even if I have a more traditional release process where I'm shipping things to my customers once or twice a year?
Yes. You're not going to have the same incentive to adopt some of these continuous techniques. We find that people who do the long cycle releases are usually the most happy with Scrum. That's the best model for Scrum. But you're going to get advantages in scalability and just sort of team focus, the traditional Konban advantages, if you move to continuous delivery, at least in the development phase, and then set your continuous delivery dial to drop that into testing wherever you want.
Yeah, and I'll just add that I think there's a tremendous advantage to having a little bit more flexibility. If you're ready to ship at a moment's notice, even if you don't plan to ship at a moment's notice, you're a little bit more insulated from the whims of management. Because I know there's sometimes when Mo's and product management side of the house say, well, it'd be great if we could just ship this one feature right now instead of waiting 6 months. Those are the types of requests that are a little bit easier to handle on this model. So another question for Andy, I think, on the idea of team management. What type of advice can you give for sharing key project information between distributed groups, setting the direction, I guess, kind of prioritizing the backlog?
We believe that there should be a product manager or product owner, I guess they call it in Scrum, who prioritizes the backlog. And you're going to have to be careful, as in any development process, that you don't send stuff to developers until really it's ready, because they'll work on stuff that's not ready and waste some time. But at that point, you're going to send it out really, once you've prioritized it, you're just going to let them take it on a pull basis and take whatever they think they can work on and ask the questions that they need to ask individually. Our model really is to think about how open source projects work, where they never have big batch meetings and really have a tremendous amount of sharing and communication. Everything is shared online. You get communication whenever you want, but you don't have to gather people together for structured meetings.
And Andy, I think we may have a whole other topic for another webinar, because this idea of retrieving information out of the black hole, that is, paper notes and conversations and email threads, I think that is probably a challenge for quite a lot of people who are listening today.
It's really, really important not to have chats and emails that go back and forth that don't go into the team workspace. That's one of the reasons we're such big advocates, is it's the idea of an online team workspace. It's going to create a lot more work for you, because somebody's going to come to you and say, hey, can you share that thing or can you distribute it? It should all be shared from the moment that it's generated so that you don't have that work.
Yeah. Okay, another question, nice and easy one to answer. Is automatic merge a built-in feature for Perforce? I think the best way to answer it is this. We've put in place the highway and the traffic signals. All that's left for you to do is kind of turn the ignition. So it's not 100% automated. We think it's actually kind of very difficult to automate something in a generic enough way that anybody would find it useful. But we've put all the infrastructure in place, and a lot of our customers do practice automatic merging. There's some blog articles and such on the topic that we can share as a follow-up, but we do have a lot of customers practicing it, and it doesn't really take a terrible amount of customization or scripting. let's see, I think we have time for a couple more questions. Let me jump to another one. Let's see. Can you outline the key differences between regular Kanban development and your proposal? So Andy, I'll throw that over to you. I think that's probably a nice way to recap some of the key features of this methodology.
Regular Kanban development is a wonderful thing which we use, hopefully to its fullest extent, in this idea of scalable, agile, and continuous delivery. So we start with Kanban, which is essentially, it's a team and task management recommendation. The recommendation of Kanban is you should only be working on tasks that you're actively working on and that you're going to finish. That's the lean principle. And what it forces you to do is to finish one task before you get to the next one. And the effect is that each task gets finished as quickly as possible. So you're using less working memory, you have less complexity in your project. That's the team and task management end of it. What we've done is we've glommed onto it some of the rest of it, which is how do you manage your code so you can actually get continuous delivery? How do you test your code so you can actually get continuous delivery? And finally, how do you manage your teams so that you can expand globally? So we've built around that Kanban idea, the principal pull and the idea of moving each thing through to completion.
Okay. Here's a great question. These configurations appear geared towards application development, traditional software development. What would CI look like for embedded systems development, where you're concerned about, say, hardware targets and platforms? So I'm sure Andy has some thoughts. I'll just mention a couple of quick things on that before I turn it over to him. So I think, certainly embedded systems development is another scale of another level of complexity. So, and I have seen that with a lot of the customers I work with. I think one of the things you need to pay attention to there is the fact that that continuous delivery dial, you may have to kind of draw the line there between a bug fix or a new feature being delivered to what's kind of considered your mainline or stable version. Do some continuous delivery there. But then you will have a point where you need to run it through another process that builds it on all the different hardware platforms you're supporting, if you have different chipsets, different host environments, things like that. So that's the place where maybe the continuous delivery dial, you might have to find a nice compromise spot. Andy, anything you want to add on there?
I don't have a lot of experience with embedded systems, and I know that a lot of the recommendations that I make are awesome for online products and might not be as appropriate for embedded systems. I will say that when I talk to embedded systems people, the one thing that I get really excited about is this idea of a daily build, that whoever's working on this project can get the same build every day. If you can figure that out with an embedded system the same way that you can with a software build and test process, then you're going to get tremendous increases in productivity. And in fact, a lot of these ideas that we're talking about now came from the auto industry in the 80s, where the auto companies had to adapt to Toyota's production process, which in its development phase has to do with literally bolting the car together with new parts every day.
Yeah, and just to second what Andy said, I think it is key to get to the point where you can at least run builds in all your different environments. So, a lot of our customers, they're doing the automatic merging to 50 places. They're working in EDA and firmware. But they've done a tremendous amount of work to be able to do something useful after the merge has happened. So being able to build, test, and deploy on all the different platforms that they support.
And I've heard about the room that Google has where they're running continuous builds literally on their devices. They just have a bazillion Android phones sitting out. So I think it's worth it to try to do that.
Yep. Here's another question about, I guess, some of the prioritization of the backlog. So if you do follow this model, how do you make sure you're capturing kind of multi-product representation? So if you're working on a larger company and you may have been following Scrum of Scrums, how do you make sure you've got all the right people participating in the backlog prioritization?
Are you asking me about that?
Yeah, I'll throw that one over to you, Andy.
Well, the first thing to do is make sure that someone is responsible for prioritizing the backlog. You'd be surprised how often it happens that someone is not responsible. And the second thing you want to do is filters. So we had this problem. Our backlog was just too big after we stuck all the teams together. And we actually built a whole new feature set in Assembla that we call multi-team, which starts by allowing you to apply filters and say, I just want to look at the repository team stuff and sort that. And we built an algorithm called ladder walk where it sort of stays in the same relative position with the other teams. So nobody can deal with a really big backlog. You're going to have to break it down and filter it at some point.
Okay.
And you can, at that point, you can delegate it out. So the other part of the question was, who's going to do this? You can start to spread that work around.
Okay, great. Let's see if I can find a couple more questions here. Oh, here's another good one. What does the Scrum model, what does that mean to this idea that was kind of key in Agile, at least up until a few years ago, that you were going to commit to a certain amount of work in the sprint? So you were doing the planning up front and kind of committing to it. What does it mean if you're not doing that anymore?
I don't like the idea of committing to work. I think that it creates a lot of work at the beginning where you're sort of trying to figure out if you should commit to something. You could be using all of that energy to get the work done. And in the latest version of the Scrum handbook, they've sort of removed the recommendation that Scrum teams commit to getting a certain amount done. I think that increases productivity. And with a continuous delivery model, you're going to have a lot of good measurements on velocity. You're going to have better measurements because you're going to be taking measurements every day on a sort of a rolling average basis. So you may actually have a better feeling about when stuff's going to get delivered.
Okay, let's see. A couple more questions here. I think we have time for one or two more. How do you, well, here's a good core one, I guess. How do you manage dependencies between tasks in the system? So I guess that might be interesting if, particularly if you have two or more developers who are working on a set of tasks that actually have a lot of dependencies between them.
Great question. I just posted a blog article yesterday on blog.assembla.com that talks about this. There's all the normal ways of dealing with dependencies, which is you make a plan and you figure out what the dependencies are. Sort of God or a manager figures that out. But there's also bottom-up escalation methods. So for instance, in our ticketing system, you can say, hey, I'm waiting for something. I'm waiting for you. You can actually set that as a relationship. And then two things can happen. You can call the person and email them, chat with them, work out what's going to happen, or you can escalate that. You can say, there's nobody at the receiving end of this. There's nobody doing this, and we need to escalate this and turn this into an organizational issue. But it's very, very important to handle dependencies in a bigger project. That's the thing that's, as the project gets bigger, that's the thing that's going to start blocking you, is that people are waiting for things. And so take a look at the article, see what you think.
Yeah, and I think one thing Andy mentioned earlier that's worth reiterating at this point, this model doesn't have to be just individuals. This could be, you know, small teams, just 2 or 3 people that kind of decide to informally tackle a task that's actually big enough that there's dependencies and they kind of piecemeal it out between each other. Or it could be, you know, kind of a more formal Scrum team. That's all certainly possible in this model, and hopefully when things are working well, the team can become a little bit actually more self-governing, where they see a list of tasks, they see what's prioritized, they grab things and figure out the best way to deliver it without a lot of the heavier planning up front.
But the point is, we are going to try to go more to this peer-to-peer, I'm waiting for you kind of planning. And I should emphasize that in our own development, we always recommend that you have feature teams, however many locations they are in. You have a feature team that has a daily stand-up report. We actually have an online form, so we don't have to spend the time on it. But they can raise an obstacle or a need, and that's where, you know, hopefully, if there really is a dependency, it'll come out of that process pretty obviously.
Yep. Okay, well, I think that's about all the time we have. I think we've actually run a few minutes over, but I know we do have a lot of great questions, so I'm glad we got to spend some extra time. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Again, we will have a copy of the recording available by the end of the week, and keep your eyes out for some additional information coming from us in the future. And like Andy mentioned, he writes about this topic quite a bit on the Assembla blog. So thanks a lot, everyone, for joining us, and hope to see you again soon.